Okay, well, let's go ahead and kick things off here. So welcome to the Stacklok user group meeting. Today is December 16th, 2024. I'm Stacy Potter, an open source community manager here at Stacklok, and I will be joined by my colleague Oz, who will be diving into Minder's view of the world very shortly. I have to be honest with you, Oz, I didn't know that what ontology meant, so I had to look it up, and then I realized it was, this philosophical thing of how the state of being or your view of the world, and I thought that was pretty clever. So obviously, we'll chat a little bit about Oz's philosophical background here. I'm sure he has some study there. Um, anyway, so I hope you're in the right place. We'll get started in just a minute, but before I kick things off to Oz, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of who we are at Stacklok and cover a few housekeeping items. So we've allocated an hour for this entire presentation today, plus Q&A. We probably won't go that long, but we do have a hard stop at the top of the hour just in case we get flooded with questions. You can always join us on our Slack or Discord channels to chat with us more there. If you have any questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat, and I'll propose them to Oz as we go along, and we'll try and get to all of them as we go. As I mentioned before, Oz and I work at Stacklok, and even though we're talking about our open source project Minder today, which we've recently, it's become a sandbox project in the OpenSSF Foundation, I wanted to introduce the company a bit first. So in a nutshell, our goal is to bring dev and security teams together to eliminate risk by bringing developers' risk intelligence into their existing workflows and tools, and by providing security teams with centralized policy control for their entire software development lifecycle. So our team's background is in creating, maintaining, and scaling open source systems, including Kubernetes and SigStore. And we're drawing on our expertise in open source and security to give developers and open source communities better tools to secure their software and manage external dependency risk. We believe that contributing to open source is a necessary part of our everyday work. So as part of daily tasks, our company leaders, engineers, and PMs build, maintain, and contribute to open source projects and lead open source initiatives that support upstream communities and advance open source security. So to learn more about who we are and what we do, you can visit us at stacklok.com, on our GitHub at github.com/Stacklok, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our Discord and meetup pages. So with that, I'm going to bring Oz onto the stage and pass it over to you. Welcome, Oz.
Hey, thanks for having me again. How's it going?
It's going well, thanks. You want to tell us a little bit about your philosophical background on?
It's not that extensive as
Okay.
I might have hinted at with this word,
Right
but
on. All right,
but it
well,
is an
I'll leave you
interesting
to it.
topic for sure.
Very good. Nice. All right, I'm gonna remove myself from the stage. I'll still be in the background, but I'll take myself off so you can have the stage.
All right, hello everybody. By now, maybe you know me or maybe you don't, but people call me Oz, and I'm an engineer here at Stacklok. And today we're going to talk about Minder's ontology or view of the world. Right? Every piece of software, especially ones that aims to be a platform, has a certain philosophy and has a certain way of looking at things and looking at resources and the way to manage them. So our intention today is to explore a little bit more how Minder views things. And especially within the world of supply chain security, this is something important to define in order to better look at how our rules and our profiles are going to apply, right? It makes it a little bit easier to understand. Now, I have to warn people, this is going to be a deep dive, so this will get hairy, uh, like me. So beware, but also please don't doubt asking questions. You're not interrupting. I'd be really happy to answer them as you're asking. So let's get going. As in the previous talk, we're going to do a very quick recap, but this is effectively what we're going to be talking about today. Minder, and this is going to be a handful. A handful. It's an open source control plane platform for supply chain security, right? So it aims to be a platform. It aims to be extendable. It aims to do a lot of automation that will help you secure your organizations. It manages different aspects of that supply chain, and we call them entities. Those entities are managed and created by providers, and we're able to apply policy to those entities via rules and profiles. And finally, we group everything via projects. So we're going to deep dive into all of these things and figure out why do we call them this way, some of them, and what are they about. All right. So the first thing that you gotta figure or that you gotta know, Minder aims to do a full map of your supply chain, right? We want this to be an extensive platform that secures and locks down all sorts of aspects of your software development lifecycle. And so you might be acquainted with this little graph right here from the Salsa project, but effectively, these are the pieces that Minder aims to map, and we're going to dive through them as we go. So, in order to integrate with your supply chain, what Minder is going to do is allow you to enroll a provider, right? And a provider is Minder's way of calling these external APIs, right? Calling these external systems to get information about your supply chain, right? Fact of the matter is that your supply chain will most likely comprise of many pieces, many pieces of software, right? And Minder needs to be able to interact with them in order to map them and secure them. And so by enrolling a provider, you grant Minder access to that integration point. And that integration point, effectively, the way that it's going to map into Minder is by creating these entities that it's going to start managing to some extent, right? And getting notified about changes in them. And so, in less abstract terms, what this is a provider is an integration, and a provider could be integration with GitHub, for instance. GitLab is another integration point. Docker Hub is yet another one, right? And so these are the places where you place things in your SDLC, right? You put code in GitHub, right? You do development there, pull requests, and so on. So that's where Minder should be. You deploy it to Docker Hub or Quay or maybe GitHub registry or GitLab registry. So that's yet another integration point for Minder. And in the future, we're going to also map workloads, we hope. And so Kubernetes could be yet another provider. We don't have that yet, but this is the thinking, right? Providers give you the ability for Minder to call those services, get information about them, and present entities that effectively you're going to monitor and guard. Entities themselves are aspects of the supply chain, right? So there are different pieces in the SDLC that, as I mentioned, will be monitored, but we measure them as checkpoints, right? And we're going to talk about those a little bit more. And finally, entities have properties, right? So all of these are different pieces that a provider will fill in. In more uh, concrete terms, these are what entities look like today, right? So an entity in Minder will be a repo that you register, an artifact, for example, like let's say a Docker container or an npm module. Uh, it could be a pull request with which you're submitting code, right? It's very important for Minder to guide that first line of defense. And releases are also different entities that Minder tracks. While you're evaluating, though, you're not going to evaluate an entity as it is. What you do is that you evaluate it in a point in time. And this is where checkpoints come into place, right? So let's say that you get an event, the provider gives the event to Minder and says, hey, something happened. Minder then evaluates that entity at a certain checkpoint, which in the case of a repo, it could be a timestamp plus the commit hash, right? But for other resources like artifacts. It could be a tag and a digest, for instance. So checkpoints differ per entities, but it's Minder's way of knowing exactly when did you do a probe, when did you do an evaluation result, and for you to know, hey, was I fine or was I compliant at this specific commit hash or at this point in time, right? So this is a really important piece of Minder evaluating the entity. At some point, you're going to get another event, and it's going to be another checkpoint that eventually gets stored in our results database, right? So this is where it's really important to defer that we have an entity and that entity gets evaluated in time, right? So Minder will continuously evaluate. Properties are something that comprises an entity. And so in order for Minder to make sense of that entity or the repo or the artifact, it caches a bunch of information for it to make sense of it. And we call those properties, right? Some of them, most of them will be static, but some of them will be refreshing over time, right? A static property could be something like an ID, right? Like that barely changes, if ever. And a refreshing property could be something like, is this repo public or private, right? Which you might toggle. And so Minder needs to be aware of this because this is important information, but at the same time, it's very minimal. So the idea is that Minder uses this to make sense of the entity and then effectively call the provider and get a lot more information later on, right? It helps us reason about it. And so this is more or less what, in Minder's view of the world, that entity would look like, right? We know the type of entity, right? And we can have several. It has an ID in Minder's world. It has a specific name that comes from the provider as well. We always allocate it to a project, and it belongs to a provider always, right? So in this case, it's a GitHub repo, if that makes sense. So entities will have properties, and these properties will range from things that are called here. And I wanted to put the last one foo because properties are something that a provider defines. A provider really says, like, hey, this is what's relevant. It could be something super random, or it could be something that makes a lot of sense, like owner and name, right? We try to constrain to the bare minimum information that you need, but sometimes it's just handy. And I wanted to portray that. Entities differ between providers, right? So you could have GitLab specific properties, and you could have GitHub specific properties. And it's up to the provider to make sense which is the important things or not. And don't worry, you don't have to deal with the provider as a user, right? But as a provider author, this is when you make a call of, you know what, in GitLab, this is super important and I use it often, so let's cache it, right? So that's where properties come in. Top level properties are properties that we expect all providers that provide a certain entity type to implement. So for repos, for example, we always expect that we'll have an upstream ID, right? We know that it's archived or we know that it's private. This is just an example. And provider specific properties are something that is namespace for the provider, and it could be whatever the provider seems fit. Minder itself will use a subset of these ones to identify the entity. And so we call this identifying properties. Something could be a little bit more complex, like here in GitHub. Sometimes we need the owner name combo, or sometimes it's just the upstream ID. But for other providers, such as GitLab, for identifying an entity, we only need the upstream ID. And again, this is not something that you should worry about, but it is something that you need to take into account if you're writing a provider yourself. Right? If you want to integrate with the Minder ecosystem and write one of these providers on your own, this is something that you should consider and know. And so the provider concept is basically an implementation of a bunch of functions that Minder will use. And so something like fetching properties is a very important thing that Minder core just provider says it, hey, give me all the properties for this entity. And the provider will do it, right? So it'll take the identifying properties, call the provider itself like GitHub or GitLab or Docker Hub, and make sense of the entity. And effectively we're going to persist it in Minder and then keep track of it and do policy and all the wonderful things that Minder does. Another thing that's important to know about providers is that it also tells us if something happened, right? So it monitors the ecosystem, like GitHub, for instance, gets a webhook in there and says, hey, something happened, you should check it out. It could be from a Git push to another event, like we changed the security policy, but that doesn't really matter. All we know is that we should reevaluate policy. And so we actually, if you look at Minder, we discard the event, we discard what happened, and we just evaluate policy, right? Effectively, we just want to know something changed and we should make sense of the identity again and reevaluate results, right? Because we're a security tool, right? Constantly, we should be looking for issues or non-issues. Maybe you fixed an issue and we got to reevaluate it that way. And so what we're going to pass in the event that happens when a provider wants to tell Minder to reevaluate is that we'll pass the property, like the identifying properties to this extent for the particular entity, and some extra hints like, hey, this came from GitHub or this came from GitLab, right? It's up to the provider to give out all of this information, and then Minder will do its thing and it'll be fine. We also have another concept of a reminder. So you yourself can tell Minder, hey, you should reevaluate this entity for whatever reason. Just if you want super fresh data, or if you suspect that the provider isn't doing the right thing, you can just call it, right? And we're in the process also of getting Reminder to be more periodic and do constant checks without the provider really caring about it, but it uses the same eventing system. And so the idea for Minder itself is for it not to be edge triggered, but to be level triggered, right? You trigger this action somehow, or you make it happen, and Minder will check the level, right? It'll check the status and evaluate the entity itself. And so, very similar to Kubernetes, this is something that we borrowed as a concept from them. We try to not rely on something that might fail, like a webhook from GitHub or GitLab or whatever, and just make it so that you can reconcile again and again and get to that desired state. This is where we start to get a bit more hairy, right? Entities themselves are not in a vacuum, right? You don't have just a repo, you don't have just a pull request. Entities come from other entities, and this is what we in Minder called origination, a concept that a colleague came up with, Evan, but it is basically what Minder takes into account. So for a repository, it's very simple. You say Minder repo register, and Minder starts tracking it, registers the eventing system, and off you go. But for other entities like pull requests, releases, artifacts, these don't exist in a vacuum. They come from something else, like a repo. And so what we do is that we automatically create those once you register the repo. If we get an event for a pull request or for a release or for something else, Minder detects, hey, this is an originating event. We create the entity, start tracking it, and they will now be evaluated, but they're protected by Minder, right? Why do we do this? So we do it effectively to tie in the life cycles, but also to start mapping your supply chain. So the main idea is that we at some point are going to get a full view of what belongs to what came from where, and give you a full view of your supply chain. And by tying the life cycles, what I mean is that a pull request without a repo doesn't make any sense. So if the pull requests get deleted, nothing happened. It just gets deleted and that's it. And we remove it from Minder too. If a repo gets deleted, then having the pull requests lying around doesn't really make sense. And so Minder will clean up. The repo gets deleted, then we get rid of the pull requests and the artifacts and so on that no longer make sense to map because you're no longer using them, right? It doesn't exist anymore. And so the relationship looks simplistically as follows, right? Entity A originates from entity B. In more solid terms, it looks like this, right? Like repo A comes or originates a pull request, or better yet, pull request B originates from repo A. Uh, Maybe the arrow could have been a bit better, but this is what this concept means, and it is, like I said, a way for Minder to map these relationships in your supply chain. Now we're in policy, and everything starts pulling together, right? Policy gets all of the details that I mentioned before about entities, pull requests, and so on, and acts on it. And so if you looked at the previous talk, you saw how policies look like. So maybe I'm not going to go through those right now, but just to recap a little bit, policy defines a state of what you want in your supply chain, right? As a profile. Profiles are collections of rules. Rule types contain all of the details about how to check a specific security control, right? So if you want to check that secret scanning is enabled, you're going to put all the verbiage of why it's important, how to fix it, what REST endpoint to check, what do you expect in the policy. All of the details is going to go in the rule type. And instantiating a rule type is just a rule in a profile, right? That's the nomenclature here. And so all of this together is a policy. And that's that. Again, this is something I mentioned in the previous talk, but policy consists of 3 steps: ingestion, evaluation, and action. And that's it, right? So if you look at the graph, what's going to happen is that the provider tells Minder, hey, something happened, you should look into it. Minder gets into the evaluation engine and then does all the events that it needs to do with the provider, right? So this would be the ingest step. It would do git clones or getting different paths in REST, right? So this would be the ingest step, and that's about the extent of integration or the extent of interaction with the policy engine and the provider itself. After that, we don't need the provider per se, and so you're just going to call the evaluation engine, which is internal to Minder, and finally actions will call the provider after that, actually. So if you do a remediation to fix or create a pull request, that'll go to the provider as well. This is a really cool new feature that we're about to roll out. So, spoilers, but we have another set of integration, another concept for Minder to integrate with other systems. This is called a data source. The idea is that providers are not enough to give you all of the information you want about an entity, right? You can make sense of the world with a provider via Git, right? To know all the files that are in your repo, or REST calls that give you status about your repo, about all the handles. But what if you want to know something else? What if you want to know if your repo has a vulnerable dependency, or if your repo or if your pull request could use a security review? So you would normally need to call another service, and that other service you can integrate to Minder into a data source, right? So the idea is that you create a data source, and that gives you access to a third-party API. That could be Stacklok Insights. It could be OSV. It could be Sonatype, OSS registry, right? So it could be anything. And so you call Minder, you put this into your policy. So in the evaluation piece of your rule type, and that's it. You have access to all sorts of information. The key difference between a data source and a provider is that data sources don't generate nor manage entities. They're just integration, they're just calls, right? So that is the main thing. And so how it would look like now, it's that, again, the provider tells Minder, hey, something happened, you should look into it. Minder schedules evaluation to happen. The engine kicks in. We do a git clone or a REST call or whatever, get into the evaluation engine, and then the eval engine can call data sources and say, hey, get me vulnerabilities, or do a security review, or something else, right? But now you can call anything within the evaluation step and expand or enhance your view of the world for the entity. right? So that's what this is about. And last but not least, super important concept is projects. Everything I just talked about before is project scoped, right? It's Minder's tenancy concept. So you can live in a multi-tenant environment in Minder and not necessarily share in between projects. However, you can share or apply rules and profiles in a hierarchical way, right? So projects are hierarchical. If you want to make sure that all of your sub teams are following the same policy, you can create the sub teams, and the top level profiles and rules will apply and trickle down the tree, right? So Minder follows a hierarchical multi-tenancy model. By default, you only have one project and that's all you get. But if you want to fall into, or if you want to test it out, give us a call. It's in beta right now. So you can just tell us about it and we'll enable it for you if you want to try it out with us. But yeah, this is what projects are for. All right. I know that was a lot to dig into. Um, by now, you may be a little bit dizzy, but bear with me. And this is recorded, so you can probably just go back and listen to it again if it's useful for you. But what's next? We're also coming up with more concepts and more integrations and more things for Minder. So I mentioned origination before. And while that's super important, it's not enough, right? The case of the matter is that supply chains are super complex things. They map all sorts of things, and we need to be able to represent these relationships in Minder, right? More importantly, a lot of entities are going to be inter-provider. So some come from one provider, some from another one. They may be intermingled. And so, in order to represent this complex world, we need to come up with a concept and we need to come up with a way for Minder to map these ones. And the most important thing is that we need to be able to make assertions about these relationships. And so, this is what we'll be exploring in order to make this a little bit more visual and a bit more understandable for folks. Take this very simple example. You have a repo and you have a release that originates from the repo, right? And all is good, except that this repo pushes an artifact into Docker Hub. And so now they're from different providers, right? We don't want to die origination because we don't want uh, we don't want to make sure that if the provider gets deleted, maybe you don't want to delete this container because it's a different system. You might be reusing it or switching to GitLab or something else. Same with the release, right? So at this point, you create a release and you tell your community, hey, folks, I just released an artifact, and this artifact is a Docker repo, right? So you may be putting it there in your links, and we want to make sure that people know that this artifact tag is tied to a release, right? So this is where relationships come from, and we need to map this somehow, right? So there will be a lot of discussion around it. If you're interested, join us in Slack. We'll be happy to discuss. It's a super interesting topic. Finally, of course, like always, we're going to be doing more rule types. Actually, even this week, the team is doing a hackathon for writing more rules because we want to integrate with more projects and get you a lot more security checks. And so that's what we're going to do. With that being said, if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them, or reach out in Slack. I'm happy to help. I hope you're not too DC by now. But yeah, it was fun. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
that was great. Thank you, Oz. That was really awesome. I will just give everyone a few moments. If you have any questions, please type them into chat and we'll address them now. I'll also put this slide back on there so that folks know how to reach us, so you can get in touch with us on Discord. We also have a Minder channel in the OpenSSF Slack, which is not unfortunately on this side, but I'll add it for next time. So yeah, I don't see any questions at this time. We got a great overview, Oz, from Brian. Thanks, Brian. And yeah, so yeah, that'll do it for today if there's no other questions. So thanks, Oz, for your time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I know it was a lot, but you can always go back and rewatch certain parts. But yeah, this definitely helped me understand Minder a little bit more. So really appreciate it. All right. Well, with that, we'll close it out, and we'll see you in January. Happy holidays, everybody, and Happy New Year. Take care. Bye-bye.